NG for 40 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened that night. That little one was gone. No heartbeat, no breathing, nothing. But you wouldn't give up on her. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. You did all the real work. You just refused to let her die, Joe interrupted gently. You held her and talked to her and willed her back to life. I've seen a lot of things in my time, but I've never seen someone call a soul back from whatever place they go when they're ready to give up. He was quiet for a moment, studying her with those kind, weathered eyes. Then he reached out and placed one calloused hand gently on her arm. That husband of yours was a fool, Sarah. You're not Barren. You're the opposite. Everything you touch comes to life. This ranch, those animals, even this old man who was pretty much just going through the motions before you showed up. You've got more mothering instinct in your little finger than most women have in their whole bodies. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. But it was the good kind of pain, the sharp, clean hurt of a wound finally being properly tended. For months, she had carried the weight of David's accusations, the medical diagnoses, the whispered judgments of a small town that measured a woman's worth by her reproductive capacity. She had internalized the belief that she was fundamentally broken, fundamentally lacking in the most basic feminine capability. But sitting on that porch, watching the animals she had helped nurture and protect, Sarah finally understood what Joe was trying to tell her. Motherhood wasn't just about biology. It was about the daily choice to put another's needs before your own, to show up even when it was inconvenient or difficult, to fight for life even when the odds seemed impossible. It was about creating safe spaces and providing comfort and teaching by example. What it meant to live with purpose and dignity. She had been doing that every day since arriving at the Double M she had mothered. Rosie, through her difficult labor, had coaxed hope back from the edge of death, had created a warm and welcoming home for Joe and herself. She had taken a struggling ranch and helped it flourish, had turned a lonely old man's final years into a time of companionship and shared purpose. The realization brought with it a peace Sarah had never imagined possible. The ache for the children she would never bear was still there, would probably always be there, but it no longer defined her. She was not barren. She was fertile in ways that mattered just as much, maybe more. She was a nurturer, a protector, a creator of life in all its forms, as summer deepened into autumn. Sarah found herself thinking often about the chain of events that had brought her to this place. If David hadn't left her, she would never have discovered her gift for ranch management. If she hadn't been desperate enough to accept Joe's offer, she would never have learned that her capacity for nurturing extended far beyond human children. If she hadn't been forced to confront her deepest fears and most painful limitations, she would never have discovered strengths she didn't know she possessed. The irony was perfect and profound. The woman who had been called Barren had become the beating heart of a ranch that was more alive and productive than it had been in years. The woman who had been left to starve had become the one who fed and nurtured everything around her. The woman who had been deemed worthless had become invaluable. On the anniversary of her arrival at the Double M, Joe surprised her with a small celebration. Nothing elaborate, just a cake from the bakery in town and a bottle of wine Maria had been saving for a special occasion. As they sat on the porch in the golden light of early evening, Joe raised his glass in a toast. "To Sarah," he said simply, who taught an old rancher that sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected places. 2 second chances, Sarah replied, touching her glass to his, and to the people wise enough to offer them. As they sat, in comfortable silence, watching Hope now, a healthy, playful yearling chase butterflies in the pasture, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. A year ago, she had been a broken woman convinced of her own worthlessness, abandoned by everyone she thought she could count on. Tonight, she was a successful businesswoman, a valued partner, and a woman who knew her own worth. The word barren no longer had any power over her. She understood now that fertility wasn't just about creating new life. It was about nurturing and protecting the life that already existed. About creating conditions where growth and flourishing were possible. By that measure, she was the most fertile woman she knew. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above the valley that had become her true home, Sarah Martinez She had legally changed her name when they formalized the partnership, smiled and whispered a prayer of gratitude for the rancher who had touched not just her belly, but her heart, and claimed her not as broken goods, but as exactly what she was. A woman whose greatest gift was her capacity to call forth life wherever she went. The scar tissue around her heart had become fertile ground, and from it had grown a life more beautiful and meaningful than any she had dared to imagine. She was no longer barren. She was abundant beyond measure. The first few weeks at the Double M passed in a blur of learning and adjustment. Sarah threw herself into the work with the fervor of someone who had been given a second chance at life. She mastered Joe's ancient cook stove, learned to separate cream from milk, and discovered she had an intuitive understanding of the bookkeeping system Joe's wife had established. The numbers told a story of careful management and gradual growth, and Sarah found satisfaction in continuing Maria's meticulous records. More surprising was her connection to the animals. The cattle, which she had expected to find intimidating, proved to be creatures of routine and simple needs. They wanted food, water, shelter, and to be left alone to do what cattle do. The pregnant heifer, a gentle red Angus Joe, had named Rosie, seemed particularly drawn to Sarah's presence, often approaching the fence when Sarah came out to check the water troughs. "She's taken a shine to you," Joe observed one morning as they watched Rosie lumber toward them, her sides bulging with the promise of new life. Maria always said animals could sense good people. Rosie wouldn't come near anyone she didn't trust. Sarah reached through the fence rails to scratch behind Rosie's ears, feeling the warm solidity of life beneath her fingers. "When is she due?" "Any day now." "This is her first calf, so she might need some help." Joe leaned against the fence post, studying both woman and cow with a practiced eye. "You interested in learning about that side of things? Birthing can be messy business, but there's nothing quite like helping bring new life into the world." Irony wasn't lost on Sarah, the woman who couldn't create life learning to help deliver it. But instead of the bitter pain she expected, she felt a flutter of genuine interest. "I'd like that," she said, and meant it. Winter settled over the valley with the gradual inevitability of seasons, but Sarah found herself unafraid of the cold for the first time in months. The ranch house was warm and welcoming, filled with the smells of home cooking and the quiet companionship of two people who had found mutual respect and purpose. Joe proved to be an excellent teacher and an even better friend. Sharing stories of his 40-year marriage to Maria and listening without judgment as Sarah gradually opened up about the pain and humiliation of her divorce. David wasn't wrong about everything, she told Joe one snowy evening as they sat by the fire working on the books. "I can't have children. The doctors were very clear about that." Joe looked up from the ledger where he was recording feed purchases, his weathered face thoughtful. "Can't and don't are two different things," he said quietly. "I've known plenty of women who bore children but never really mothered them. I've known others who never had kids of their own but raised half the county's children through teaching, or fostering, or just being the kind of person kids knew they could trust." He gestured toward the window where they could see the barn lit against the darkness. "Those animals out there don't care if you gave birth to them. They just care that you show up every day, that you notice when something's wrong, that you put their needs ahead of your own comfort. It's mothering, far as I can see." 3 days before Christmas, Rosie went into labor. Sarah woke to Joe, shaking her shoulder gently, his face creased with concern. "It's time," he said simply, and Sarah pulled on her boots and coat without question. Following him out into the bitter, pred-on darkness, the barn was warm and filled with the sweet smell of hay and the low, urgent sounds of an animal in distress. Rosie was lying on her side in the largest stall, her breathing labored and her eyes wide with confusion and fear. Joe knelt beside her, his hands already busy with examination. "Calf's turned wrong," he said without looking up. "Breech presentation, we're going to have to help her." He glanced at Sarah, who stood frozen at the stall entrance. "I need you to talk to her, keep her calm while I try to turn the calf. Can you do that?" Sarah had never felt less qualified for anything in her life, but something in Rosie's frightened eyes called to her. She knelt by the cow's head, placing one hand on the warm neck while the other stroked the soft muzzle. "It's okay, girl," She heard herself saying, her voice steady and soothing despite the panic fluttering in her chest. "We're here. You're not alone." For the next hour, Sarah knelt in the straw and hay, whispering encouragement to Rosie while Joe worked with quiet competence to correct the calf's position. When the moment of birth finally came, it happened with startling suddenness. One moment there was struggle and strain, and the next there was a wet, steaming bundle of new life lying in the straw. "There she is," Joe said softly, his hands gentle as he cleared the calf's mouth and nose. Perfect little heifer. But instead of the immediate activity Sarah expected, the calf lay still and silent. "Is she?" Sarah couldn't finish the question. Joe was already moving, his weathered hands working with practiced urgency. Rubbed the calf's chest, cleared her airways again, then looked at Sarah with an expression she couldn't read. "Sometimes they need a little encouragement," he said quietly. "Sometimes they need to know someone believes in them." Without conscious thought, Sarah found herself reaching for the still form, her hands joining Joe's and massaging the tiny chest. "Come on, baby," she whispered, the endearment flowing naturally, despite the fact that this wasn't her child. Wasn't even her species. "Come on, breathe for us. Your mama's waiting to meet you." She felt it before she saw it, the faint flutter of life beneath her palms, the subtle expansion of tiny ribs. Then the calf's eyes opened, darkened, wondering, and she let out a weak but unmistakable bellow that brought Rosie's head up in immediate anxious interest. "There you go," Joe said, and Sarah heard something like wonder in his voice. "Look at that. Just needed someone to believe in her." As Rosie began the ancient ritual of cleaning her newborn daughter, Sarah sat back on her heels and felt something shift inside her chest. The pain was still there, the knowledge that she would never hold her own child, never experience the particular joy and terror of motherhood in the traditional sense. But alongside the pain was something new, a recognition that love and nurturing could take many forms, that the ability to care for and protect vulnerable life wasn't limited to biological relationships. "What should we call her?" Joe asked, watching mother and daughter with the satisfied expression of a job well done. Sarah looked at the calf, now struggling to her feet with the determined awkwardness of all newborns, and felt a smile spread across her face. "Hope," she said without hesitation. "Her name is Hope." Spring came early that year, and with it a transformation that surprised even Sarah. The work that had initially been a refuge from despair became a source of genuine satisfaction and pride. She found herself looking forward to the morning routine of checking on the animals, discovered an unexpected talent for coaxing maximum production from the vegetable garden Maria had established, and took quiet pleasure in the way the ranch books showed steady, modest profit under her careful management. More importantly, she found herself laughing again. Joe had a dry sense of humor that emerged once he was comfortable around her, and their evening conversations ranged from practical discussions of cattle breeding to philosophical debates about everything from politics to the best way to make pie crust. It was the kind of easy companionship Sarah had never experienced. Even in her marriage, friendship, based on mutual respect and shared purpose, rather than romantic attraction or social expectations, the change in her was evident to everyone who knew her. The hollow-cheeked desperation was gone, replaced by the healthy glow of someone who spent her days outdoors doing meaningful work. Her movements had regained the confident grace of a woman comfortable in her own skin, and her eyes held the bright alertness of someone engaged with life, rather than merely enduring it. It was on a warm May morning, as Sarah stood in the pasture, watching Hope gamble around her patient mother, that Joe made an observation that would change everything. "You know," he said conversationally, leaning against the fence rail beside her, "I've been thinking about expansion." Sarah glanced at him, noting the careful casualness of his tone. "What kind of expansion?" "Well, the ranch is doing better than it has in years, thanks to your management. And I'm not getting any younger." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I've been thinking it might be time to make you a partner rather than just an employee. Equal shares, equal say in how things are run. What do you think?" The offer took Sarah's breath away. In the span of 6 months, she had gone from abandoned and destitute to being offered partnership in a successful ranch. But more than the financial security, it was the recognition implicit in Joe's proposal that he valued her contributions, trusted her judgment, and wanted her as a permanent part of his life's work. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "Say yes," Joe suggested with a smile. "Unless you're planning to run off and break my heart like every other good cook I've ever found." Sarah laughed, wiping away tears she didn't remember starting to cry. "Yes," she said firmly. "Yes, absolutely yes." That afternoon, as they sat on the porch discussing the legal details of their new partnership, Joe made another observation that caught Sarah off guard. "You know," he said, watching Hope nurse contentedly beside her mother, "that calf wouldn't be alive without you." "I've been raunchy." The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves and broken dreams across the Miller ranch as Sarah pressed her face against the cold kitchen window, now watching her husband's truck disappear down the gravel road for what she knew would be the last time. 3 years of marriage, 5 years of trying, and countless visits to specialists had all led to the same devastating conclusion. She would never give him the son he desperately wanted to carry on the family name. Oh. The word Barren echoed in her mind like a death sentence, spoken not just by doctors in sterile offices, but whispered by neighbors at the grocery store and shouted by her husband in moments of cruel frustration. "You're nothing but a broken woman," David had spat that morning, his face twisted with a bitterness that had grown like weeds between them. "My family's worked this land for 4 generations, and you can't even give me one child to pass it on to. You're useless." He had packed his belongings with the methodical precision of a man who had already checked out emotionally months ago, leaving behind only the divorce papers on the kitchen table and a bank account he had systematically emptied over the past weeks, now at 28. Sarah found herself alone in a house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. With winter approaching and no means to heat the sprawling ranch house or buy groceries, the nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. Her family had disowned her years ago when she married David against their wishes. She had burned every bridge in pursuit of a love that had turned to ash in her hands. The irony wasn't lost on her, that she who was called Barren now found herself in the most barren circumstances imaginable, abandoned, penniless, and facing a Montana winter that could kill the unprepared. For 2 weeks, Sarah survived on the canned goods David had left behind, rationing them like a prisoner counting down to execution. She sold what little jewelry she owned to buy a few bags of groceries, but the money disappeared as quickly as warmth fled the unheated house. The electricity had been shut off on Tuesday, the water would follow by Friday, and the first snow was already dusting the distant mountains like a warning of the brutal months ahead. She had applied for every job within 50 miles, but in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, word of her failure as a wife had spread like wildfire, and doors closed in her face before she could even speak. On the morning she found ice in her coffee cup, Sarah made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of surrendering to despair, she walked out to the old barn behind the house, where David had kept his few head of cattle before selling them. Off in his methodical destruction of their shared life, the structure was sound, built by his grandfather's hands with the kind of craftsmanship that endured through generations. If she was going to freeze to death, at least she would die with dignity. And perhaps the cold would take her quickly. She had been in the barn for 3 days, surviving on melted snow and the last can of beans, when she heard the truck engine cutting through the morning silence. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Had David returned to torment her further? But the vehicle that rounded the corner was a battered Ford pickup she didn't recognize, driven by a man whose weathered face spoke of decades spent working under the open sky. He was probably in his 60s, with silver hair peeking out from under a worn Stetson and kind eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Ma'am," he called out as he approached the barn, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to working with frightened animals. "I'm Joe Martinez from the Double M Ranch down the valley. Heard you might be in some trouble." "Up here." He paused at the barn entrance, respectful enough not to intrude, but close enough that she could see the genuine concern etched in the lines around his eyes. "Mind if we talk for a minute?" Sarah wanted to disappear into the hay bales, to hide from this stranger's kindness, because kindness had become so foreign to her that it felt like mockery. But something in his voice, patient, unhurried, without judgment, made her step forward into the pale morning light. She knew she looked like a scarecrow, hollow-cheeked and wearing the same clothes for the 4th day running. But Joe Martinez looked at her as if she were simply another human being deserving of basic dignity. "I don't need charity," she said, the words automatic, a defense mechanism worn smooth by repetition. But even as she spoke them, her stomach growled audibly. Betraying her desperation, Joe removed his hat, running weathered fingers through his silver hair. "Well, that's good, because I'm not offering any," he said, with a slight smile that transformed his entire face. "What I am offering is a job. My wife passed 2 years ago, and I've been trying to manage the ranch house and the business side of things on my own. I'm a fair hand with cattle, but I can barely boil water without burning it, and my bookkeeping looks like it was done by a drunk chicken. I need someone who can cook, keep house, handle the books, and maybe help with the animals when needed. Room and board, plus a fair wage. It's nothing fancy, but honest work for someone willing to do it." The offer hung in the air between them like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person, and Sarah found herself afraid to reach for it. In her experience, kindness always came with conditions, with expectations that she would inevitably fail to meet. "Why me?" she asked, hating the way her voice cracked on the words. "You don't even know me." "Everyone in town knows She stopped, unable to voice the word that had become her identity. "I know you're a woman who's been dealt a bad hand," Joe said quietly. "I know you're too proud to ask for help even when you're starving. And I know that sometimes the best people are the ones who've been knocked down hard enough to understand that every day above ground is a gift." He settled his hat back on his head with the deliberate movements of a man who chose his actions. Carefully, "I also know that my cattle have been getting loose through a gap in the south fence for 3 weeks now. And I haven't had time to fix it because I spent yesterday burning my attempt at beef stew and this morning trying to figure out why my books don't balance." Despite everything, Sarah found herself almost smiling. There was something refreshingly honest about his admission of incompetence, a humility that made her want to trust him, even though trust had been beaten out of her by months of disappointment. "I don't know anything about cattle," she admitted. "Well, I don't know anything about making a decent meal that won't poison us both," Joe replied. "Seems like we might be able to help each other out." He gestured toward his truck. "Why don't you come take a look at the place? No commitment. Just see if it feels right. If it doesn't, I'll bring you right back here. No questions asked." The Double M Ranch sprawled across a valley that seemed to capture and hold the light in ways that made Sarah catch her breath. House was modest but well built, with a wraparound porch that spoke of summer evenings spent watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The barn was newer than the one she'd been sheltering in, and the fenced pastures held maybe 30 head of cattle that looked healthy and well cared for, despite Joe's protests about his inadequacies. "Your wife had good taste," Sarah said as they walked through the kitchen, noting the cheerful yellow curtains and the herbs growing in pots on the windowsill. "Maria had a gift for making any place feel like home." Joe agreed, his voice soft with memory. "She always said a house was just wood and nails until someone filled it with love and good cooking." He opened the refrigerator, revealing a collection of takeout containers and what appeared to be several failed cooking experiments. "As you can see, I've been failing on both counts. I've spent the morning walking the property," Joe explaining. The routine of ranch life with the patience of a born teacher. He showed her the pregnant heifer who was due any day, the old bull who was gentle as a lamb despite his intimidating size, and the chicken coop where a dozen hens provided fresh eggs daily. With each step, Sarah felt something inside her chest, beginning to uncurl, like a plant that had been too long without sunlight finally turning its face toward warmth. "The work's not easy," Joe warned, as they sat on the porch steps, sharing sandwiches he'd bought from the diner in town. "Ranch life means early mornings, long days, and no such thing as weekends. Weather doesn't care if you're tired or sick, or just don't feel like dealing with it. Animals depend on you every single day, and they can't take care of themselves." "Sounds like you're trying to talk me out of it," Sarah observed, surprising herself with the hint of teasing in her voice. Joe grinned, and she realized it was the first genuine smile she'd seen directed at her in months. Just want you to know what you'd be getting into. Some folks think ranch life is romantic until they're slogging through mud at 5 in the morning to check on a cow having trouble calving. That evening, as Joe drove her back to collect her few belongings from the Miller place, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope she'd carried through doctor visits and failed pregnancies, but a quiet, steady confidence that perhaps her life wasn't over after all. Maybe David had been wrong. Maybe her worth wasn't measured solely by her ability to produce children. Maybe she could find purpose and meaning in caring for something other than the babies she would never have.